4 years ago, I wrote a book called Lost: A Search for Meaning, which was all about the first couple seasons of Lost and the religious symbolism and theological ideas and Easter eggs and things that were found throughout the show. So I figured now that the show's over, I should go back and revisit a few of those ideas that I outlined in the chapters in the book, just to see how they matched up. So the first chapter I dealt with was numbers and symbols, and of course there are symbols from the I Ching and the numbers themselves, 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42, and so on throughout the show. In the first couple of seasons, there were all kinds of theories about where this was leading, and it turns out that the numbers themselves were specifically the seat numbers in the airplane of Flight 815, where the candidates to replace Jacob were sitting. Now, as far as any other religious significance other than that, or any other symbolism, they didn't really go into that, although we still know that the sum total of those numbers, 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, and 42, does equal 108. And that number was actually found on the inside of the hatch where Desmond was, and as I mentioned in the book, it is a religiously significant number. The second theme that was dealt with in the book is dark and light, and obviously this was a very clear symbol that was used throughout the show. And in the end, the biggest, most obvious representations of darkness and light, of course, were Jacob on the side of light, and Smokey, Smoke Monster, Locke, the Loch Ness Monster, whatever you call them, on the side of dark. What was interesting about that, I thought, was that the idea that they presented that the island was sort of this cork that was keeping the forces of evil on the island, but at the same time, what they had to do in order to kill the smoke monster was to turn off the light that was actually keeping him there on the island, because it was also the thing that was making him immortal. Chapter 3 in the book was called Saved from What? And of course the idea of salvation was a big one, and I was really glad that they brought in Bernard and Rose back at the end of the show, because that was a big one that I brought up toward the beginning of the show. If you remember, Bernard could not wait to get off the island. He felt like he was imprisoned being on the island until he found out that Rose was terminally ill, and the only thing keeping her alive was staying on the island. All of a sudden the island became his salvation. In the very final episode, they all gather in this church, this interfaith church, and it actually doesn't appear to be actually heaven. It appears to be a place, they say in the show, that the Losties actually created for themselves to meet, and it's this sort of gathering place where people who were important in each other's lives come back together to let go and move on. So you can assume that if you understand salvation to be a healing experience, or a bringing back together of brokenness, or taking something that's broken and made whole, then yes, there was salvation or redemption in the show. Next is the idea of the others, and of course this was addressed largely in the first few seasons, to the point that there wasn't really much mystery around it. But really the most interesting thing about all that was the idea of otherness, and how even among the people on the plane, like the tailies and the people from the main fuselage, sort of otherized each other, and they saw the people that they didn't know as the enemy, and we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, and we're on the side of light and they're on the side of dark. It's just a common human tendency to otherize groups that we're threatened by or afraid of, or that at least we don't know about. The one particularly interesting thing I thought was in the very final scenes right before everybody goes into the church, Ben stays outside and he says he's not ready yet. And actually once we find out that the church is a place where these characters meet after they die, Ben is obviously not ready to let go of whatever it is that he's hanging on to. So he holds back. The next chapter in the book is about faith and reason, and of course the way this was mostly played out throughout the show was between Locke and Jack Shepherd, and of course the man of reason, or the man of science, was Jack, and the man of faith was Locke. The interesting thing is that in the last couple of years, Jack actually was the one who took on the role of a man of faith, and was actually starting to believe that he had a greater purpose in life. As far as the way that faith and reason played out in the show, it seems that the heart wins out, that faith wins out over reason. And in fact, the very way that the show was left kind of open-ended, and not all of the I's were dotted and the T's were crossed for every answer being wrapped up in a nice little bow, it would suggest that the entire storyline is open to interpretation, the symbols are open to interpretation, and what happens next. So I think it's that idea that we are going to make of reality and make of life what we read into it and what we hold as important and sacred. Chapter 6 in the book was called Fate and Destiny. From the beginning, Locke believed, once he had seen into the eye of the island, he believed that there was a greater purpose for all of them there, and of course it almost drove him crazy, digging out the hatch, and this plagued him throughout the show. Interestingly, what Locke saw as his destiny actually led him to his death, and actually to be used as a pawn by the smoke monster. So it probably wasn't exactly what he had in mind, but obviously that's one of those things that faith is a powerful tool, and sometimes it may lead us in the wrong direction. But the most redeeming and most encouraging theme around fate and destiny is that ultimately in the end of the show, no one was forced to do anything. So there was no fatalistic, predetermined kind of existence that any of these characters had to lead. They were all given the choice. Chapter 7 in the book is called The End is Near. And interestingly enough, of course, I would have had no way of knowing, and it's not that it was a shocker of a final title or anything, but the very last episode was called The End. The funny thing is that the way that the show was left, it certainly wasn't it was an end for our characters, in that we finally realized that they were all dead, but it was not the end. And so although it was the end of the show, they were obviously just letting go of one reality and moving on to another. And so the very idea of endings was sort of turned on its head at the final resolution of the show, and that we realized this is really just as the band Semisonic once said, that every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. There was the end of the show that gave birth to new life for the Losties in another reality. The final chapter that I put into the book, I actually debated about not including. It's called Purgatory, and the reason that I almost didn't put it in is because the creators of the show were asked early on, is this place purgatory? And they said patently, no, it's not purgatory. The reality is there were so many parallels to the philosophies and the ideas, in various religions about a holding place like purgatory, that it was hard not to acknowledge that. And in fact, once the show resolved, it seems more convincing that this island was actually some sort of a purgatory. And you may call it what you will, but the reality is that this was a place where souls or spirits or the essence of these characters were bound to resolve issues that they had not dealt with in their lives, and that would hold them back from being able to move on to a more unbound, unhindered existence beyond physical life. One final thought on the show: the very final scene where they actually show the wreckage of the plane in complete silence. It's a very sobering image. It takes us all the way back to the beginning, and of course, we close with Jack closing his eyes in the very same bamboo forest as he opens his eyes after the wreck in the very first place. So we basically come all the way back around to where we started. And in that way, I almost think that it was sort of a nod to the sort of cycles of nature, the cycles of life, and maybe that there is no particular beginning or end, but only reincarnation, if you will, or reiteration in another form. The other thing that it pointed out, to me at least, was that yes, in fact, the writers did know where they were going with this show from the beginning. They actually took this incredibly complex story arc and crafted it over 6 seasons and brought it to the resolution that they had intended all the way from the beginning. So whether we viewers were satisfied or not, the very fact that they were able to do something this complex, this sophisticated, and intellectually challenging as it was on network television, I think is to be commended.